Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Occasionally, we like to depart from serious history on this podcast to go and chase what I call the whimsical episodes. That's the term that I have for them in my head when we're talking about doing one of these. And I'm joined today by some of our regular show contributors. In this case, it includes Mr. Eric Bond. Mr. Bond, how are you today?
I do very nicely, Don. How about you?
Not too bad at all. And I'm also joined by again, he has a number of different titles and a number of different roles, but most of you know him as the purveyor of the image that I see on the screen right now, which I think is shown up someplace else, which looks amazingly like the Death Star and the Apple logo all at the same time. That would be the man, the myth, the legend, Chris Coppola. How are you, Chris?
Hello to the good people.
Yeah, that's our standing running joke now. No matter how I set it up, that's what you're going to get. Today, I mentioned we're going to be doing something that's more of a whimsy episode, which is sort of getting us back into, you will have heard in our last episode, a little bit of an explanation about what's been going on in the real world and around the podcast here and while we've been sort of silent for a couple of weeks. So this is a good place to jump back in. May the 4th is the day before Cinco de Mayo on some calendar. Cross-reference another episode there, Chris. I saw the expression on your face. We did that episode about a year ago talking about Cinco de Mayo. But May the 4th has come to now be a recognized date, I guess, on a lot of calendars associated with, I don't know, a particular movie, guys. You guys familiar with this at all? You know what I'm referring to? A movie franchise by any chance? Bueller?
Yes, the Ferris Bueller actually premiered on May 4th.
Yeah, I don't think that's true.
Well, also, it only had a TV show.
Yes.
What? Yes, which we have all agreed for the good of society to forget.
Yes, we're talking about the infamous Christmas special.
Yeah. No, it was Wookiee Life Day special.
Well, there you go.
It was the Wookiee Life Day special.
And for those of you that have never seen, I will find the link and put it in the show notes to a YouTube video. For those of you that have never seen the Star Wars Christmas special, I don't know if it's better to come into it sober or in some other state, but either way, it's going to be an altering experience for you. I will just leave it at that. And of course, we're talking about Star Wars here in May the 4th. Because of May the Force be with you. And we just thought it would be fun. We're talking about this around Oscar time. We never got around to doing it. So we'll probably reserve it for next Oscar season. But so many iconic movies that we know, and Star Wars definitely fits in that category. One of the early episodes of this show was around what if, Star Wars had never happened. So I'll put the link to that also in the show notes. For those of you that know Robert Koshu, who's now become a more regular contributor, that was his first appearance as a guest host back in the day on A Fork in Time. But Star Wars has definitely impacted culture, and it definitely impacted careers, to say the least. I was just sitting here thinking, who doesn't know probably the three most famous actors or actresses that were in Star Wars and the careers they had after that? That would be Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and of course, Harrison Ford. It definitely changed their career trajectories, no doubt about it. But they weren't necessarily the people who might have played those parts. And so where this comes over to being a alternate history podcast is we're going to look just briefly at a world that didn't have those actors and actresses that we know that played those parts, but what if other actors and actresses had played those parts? And so this one is, again, it falls in that category of what I think of as being sort of more of a whimsy episode. This is not serious hardcore history, but it is impactful in terms of modern culture and, modern entertainment history anyway, if we change this a little bit. So I'm going to go around the room here, and I think we each have seen some of these things on the internet. I invite you to do your own Google search to sort of say who else could have played these parts. You will see names you never dreamed you would have seen associated with this. And working out the veracity of that is true. But Eric, you were the one that sort of suggested we come back around to this after talking about it as a broad topic. So I'm going to ask you first. I think of the iconic role in Star Wars. No doubt it's Luke, right? And he's the protagonist of the story. But probably in my case, I was a almost 10-year-old kid when the movie actually premiered. Action figures were there in my second grade classroom when they became popular things that were there, the little small action figures that were most sought after. Everybody, I think, maybe you wanted to be Luke, but most of us wanted to be Han Solo, I think, at the end of the day. So my first question for you, Eric, is who are some of the actors that you have heard were up for the role that eventually was landed by Harrison Ford for Han Solo? And let's talk briefly about just the career trajectory, I guess, change that would have had perhaps on Harrison Ford's career, but on some of these other actors as well. So who's the first one that pops into your head, Eric?
For the first one that pops into my head, it would be Kurt Russell. You know, he was, of course, this probably one of the most famous like child stars to then become a legit movie star in his own right upon adulthood. He was in talks for the role, and I want to say he was one of the top two choices before they went with Harrison Ford, who there were some contractual issues in possibly having him cast as Han. I remember from the DVD set, they had a making of a feature where they even talked about like, yeah, we got Harrison Ford to go over lines, and he would literally be reading as Han Solo for other actors playing like Princess Leia or being considered for Luke Skywalker. And essentially everybody got so used to Harrison Ford as Han Solo, they were like, yeah, I guess it should be him. Contracts be damned. We're going with Han. But I think Kurt Russell would be he would have the charisma. He would definitely bring in that energy. And I think for somebody who did a lot of science fiction projects, he would be able to sell the jargon. George Lucas is not exactly known for his naturalistic dialogue. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, so you have somebody who you mentioned been a child, had been a Disney staple for a number of things, in I guess kids slash almost moving towards tween kind of movies is how I think of some of his, what's there in terms of he was a child actor, but he also growing up into some of these roles later, like the computer wore tennis shoes and
That was
some.
the first Russell movie I ever saw, and I was obsessed with that movie when I was 10.
Yeah, so here, that's what 70, 69, 70-ish.
Yeah.
He's coming along there, so he's recognizable. He would have been if you'd put Kurt Russell on the movie poster, people would have known who that was, even more so than eventually we know who was there. But Carrie Fisher was not a household name. Harrison Ford was not a household name. Mark Hamill was certainly not a household name. When you discovered that the voiceover is being done, okay, James Earl Jones, I know who that is, kind of thing. But we know these names now. But I sort of agree with you. I can see Russell in the role because I think of roles that he did after that sort of played a little bit of the rogue, kind of hero, anti-hero, almost kind of thing. I think there's a lot of Han Solo in some of the roles that he took on for the next 10 years. Thinking a little bit about, in terms of just a little bit more of the grit, Escape from New York, I guess is probably what I remember him most for, as being, a kid, but also, along the lines later, what was it, Big Trouble in Little China and stuff like that, where he sort of plays these more gritty hero kind of things. So I could see him in that role.
Or especially the most gritty of all of his roles, Overboard with Goldie Hawn.
Yeah.
But I think Kurt Russell would be, especially when we look at it from a legacy point of view, is that because he had been in the Disney system, eventually, if the movies do well enough that Disney still buys out the franchise eventually, well, Kurt Russell is a franchise player. So essentially, he might do a better job than Harrison Ford in the newer movies, for instance. Now, I think Harrison Ford probably the best actor out of all of them. I think he's definitely had the most diverse career.
Yeah,
The-
yeah. So so go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, the one thing I was thinking about is somewhat of an aside. In the Family Guy takeoff of Star Wars, the Han Solo character comes on the screen and says, I'm the only one whose career isn't destroyed by this movie, because he has gone on to have such a varied career. And that's something to think about, is that effect of when you break out in a movie that turns into a franchise, do you become I'm sitting here thinking about Carrie Fisher. She's in the Blues Brothers, and I to the what other movies did she
When
really
Harry
break
Met
out in?
Sally,
Okay.
Eventually,
oh, go ahead, Don.
Eventually later, the thing that I most remember seeing her in after that was a movie called Under the Rainbow.
Oh,
Okay.
is it about Dorothy? Not
It's-
Dorothy.
Yeah,
Judy Garland?
it's about it's sort of a farcical slapstick comedy that's about what goes on around the making of the Wizard of Oz.
Okay.
In this case, it's managing the cast of actors that were the secondary cast, primarily those that played the Munchkins and other things as well.
Mm.
It's Chevy Chase is in that movie. It's a very it ain't Princess Leia. We'll just put it that way.
Right. So like Mark Hamill was in a movie called The Big Red One. I've seen him in. Not much else after that. So it might be, it might be one of those that, hey, this launched some careers, and Disney has certainly been cranking out enough of these movies with these characters that you can make legitimately a career out of playing one of these characters. But this could be where some other careers go to die.
Yeah. The thing that I'm, not to confuse my Star Wars and my Star Trek, and I understand the danger in doing so, although J.J. Abrams owns both of them sort of right now in some way, shape, form, or fashion, is eventually Leonard Nimoy writes a book called I'm Not Spock. And it's the same thing that you're talking about there, Chris, in terms of, the blessing and a curse of an iconic role can be exactly that, a blessing and a curse.
Right.
To some degree, Leonard Nimoy is going to have a constant stream of income
Oh,
for the rest of his life. Oh, wow. In fact, what you can't see is that Eric is actually holding up the cover of the book. Didn't know that this was there. Leonard Nimoy. I am Spock.
I am Spock. This is the sequel that he wrote to I Am Not Spock. And in the preface, and basically the first chapter is him talking about so I may have gone too far with I Am Not Spock.
Right.
To be fair, when did that come out? And it's probably back around when J.J. Abrams was remaking this and looking for cameo appearances.
But I think, Chris, you hit it on the head in the sense of, this thing can make a career or break a career, depending on what happens here. In the case of, I think for those three, what I think of as being, the primary, the trio of stars, they're at the middle of that. I mean, there's other things that are there because it's two droids and a guy in a big hairy suit, that's playing a Wookiee called Chewbacca. But, you don't, if you ask the average person, what does Peter Mayhew look like? They couldn't tell you because
they will probably reference Chewbacca. They think he needed a shave. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And Anthony Daniels and I know his last name is Baker, the guy that was inside of R2D2 for most of that. They're part of the cast. They're a huge part of the cast. And David Prowse, who actually physically plays Vader, but is not the voice of Vader because of what happens there. Yes, they're all important parts of this universe and this cast that produces the first three trilogy of movies, but the three big are Luke, Leia, and Han, and those are going to be Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford. And of the three, they've all gone on to have careers, but nothing like the career that Harrison Ford has had.
I would say Harrison Ford has the most prolific career. I think Carrie Fisher definitely has a lot of cult classics. In the Name of My Fiance Grace, I must point out the classic film with Rick Mayhew, I think it is, which is Drop Dead Fred.
Mhm.
Which is reviled in some circles, but I love it. And then I think Mark Hamill probably doing the best financially, just because he has gotten so engrossed in voice acting, specifically the Joker for the DC animated universe, which was very important to me growing up. But
Yeah.
yeah, they've all had various and varying careers. Definitely.
Yeah, and so when you mentioned Kurt Russell as an alternative, that we're going to pop back and forth between the real careers and the alternative. Kurt Russell had a career before. He had a career when he didn't land this role. Afterwards, he's done okay, historically over his career. Would his career have gone in a different path or trajectory? I think probably. He probably would have had a chance at better roles down the road. He may have had more of the Harrison Ford-esque path that he would have gone on to, because he had the past success. And then, as Eric pointed out, he's part of the organization which eventually comes back around and buys the franchise eventually, some decades later. But I think it would not have derailed Russell's career to be in this role and it being as popular as it would have been. It would have been an enhancement, and that may have taken him on to other things. Just again to pop back for a second, Harrison Ford does go down the path of, then sliding almost fairly soon thereafter, I guess it's 3-4 years later, into the other iconic role of his career. That's a recurring role, that being of Indiana Jones, beginning with Raiders of the Lost Ark and through the Indiana Jones films. Interesting enough, there Tom Selleck was the one who could have landed or slid into that role, but Harrison Ford managed to slide over into that. So he has two long-running multi-film iconic roles in the sense of Han Solo and Indiana Jones.
And Jack Ryan.
That's true. Later, I guess he made 3 of the Clancy films, 4 of the Clancy films, at least 3, right?
Well, there were I'm thinking 2, Clear and Present Danger and Patriot Games. Call back to our next episode. Forward to our next episode. Back because we just did it. Forward to it. Yeah. Yeah. But he's done franchises.
Yeah.
And also, one of my dad's favorite movies, Presumed Innocent.
Which was a very different film. A film from the either late 80s or early 90s regarding Henry. A very different film.
And I think that's an interesting thing. There was another actor which was mentioned for this, and I'm going to go ahead and throw this out there, as Sylvester Stallone, who has had some other success with other franchises, except he's playing the exact same character in both of them.
Spy Kids.
Right.
It's 3D. I get it.
Yes, fine.
Yeah. And it's interesting there because Stallone, Rocky is the year before, I guess, Star Wars.
Yes.
So, but again, you think about the production timeline on films, we're talking here about the casting of Star Wars, I think probably actually being before the release of Rocky. So, it would have been the 1-2 punch of that's Rocky and he's a space pirate too, kind of thing, Yo, Leah, that's the first place that I want to go. But Stallone is one of the ones that was mentioned there because they were looking for, this sort of, I don't want to call it an ethnic vibe, but sort of a tough guy kind of, not your typical, not your, like I say, the hero that's
anti-hero. The anti-hero. We talked a little bit about kind of the connection between, and I know we'll talk more about this, Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola, and kind of the Northern California artistic movement that led to a big push for cinematic anti-heroes, almost in reaction to the classical studio system of the Western, where he has to be wearing white. He has to be the good guy.
Well, even in fact, in the production of Star Wars, for most of the movie, what is Luke wearing? White. It is sort of the white hat good guy kind of thing.
Yeah.
And Harrison, the Han Solo character is in, the
Black vest.
But
Yeah.
he's got that edge to him. He's got that anti-hero edge to him.
Correct. So you mentioned there, you made the reference to Coppola. One of the other potentials that I've heard for, which is really weird to me. Just last night, I was rewatching one of my favorite films and involves him. One of the best performances I think that's ever been put down on film. But can you imagine Al Pacino as Han Solo? Apparently, there was discussions at some point. Apparently, there was consideration of him for the role. Anybody else struggle with that, or is that just me?
No, I definitely am closing my eyes and picturing just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in when he's in the Dagobah system. Yeah. Yeah, that just works for me on some level.
I think Al Pacino would be a strange choice, mostly because he can do Shakespeare. I have part of my theatrical education was watching him. They had a pro cut of Merchant of Venice where he's playing Shylock, and it's like, okay, he is able to do more. He is able to do a range. Science, and we're gonna get into this topic eventually, but let's just here I'm putting it down. Star Wars is science fantasy in that it is combining science fiction and fantasy elements because they are relying on a magic system, but they have spaceships. So I always go with science fantasy to describe it.
Yeah, I think of it far more as a fantasy film than I do as a traditional, science fiction film. Although it just popped into my head all of a sudden, another Harrison Ford role that I had forgotten about. The role, in Blade Runner.
Oh yeah, I still need to finish that.
So there's there's another class that being, I think, more along the lines of classic science fiction without a doubt. Anyway, just Harrison Ford's had a good career. That's the one thing we could say that is sort of that I think is indisputable here. But I struggle with the idea of a Pacino in the role, just because I don't think of him as being, although he certainly proved it later in later films, things like Scarface. He can be an action guy. There's no doubt that he can be an action guy. But so much of what I think of him being around is sort of more of a brooding character figure, where it's around, and how that would have portrayed into, as Eric well points out, a science fantasy sort of kind of genre would have been an interesting take on that.
Yeah. Have you seen a Dungeon Siege Tale? It's a U-Bowl movie. I can't remember, but it's based. Ray Liotta plays a wizard. He plays a wizard, and he's still Ray Liotta. Ray Liotta, great actor. I don't think he could. There's just a psychological shift you need to make when you're doing a fantasy work that some actors just can't make that jump.
Yeah, I agree. Having said that, again, got Michael Corleone in Godfather and Godfather Part 2. You will be hard pressed, I think, find any better portrayal on film everywhere. So he may have made Han Solo work. It just wouldn't have been the Han Solo that I would have remembered from my youth. Any other names that you've heard of that just really pop on that role before we jump over to something else?
I have one, but it's going to be a whole possible conversation that goes along with it.
That's okay.
Have anything?
No, go ahead. I think I know where you're about. I think I know where you're about to go to, Eric.
Okay. If Billy D. Williams had been cast as Han Solo, do you think they would have kept the romance with Leia?
That's an interesting question, because I've heard that Williams was considered. That's part of the reason that he appears in the Lando role that exists in the that would be in episodes 5 and 6, the second and third movies.
No.
For those of you that are mathematically challenged, the third movie, Empire Strikes Back, and then ultimately in Return of the Jedi. That's a great question, Eric. I think it is one of those interesting things to talk about in terms of the timing of when that would have been, the mid 70s. This was a big budget film taking something of a chance for a studio. I mean, we think of it, we don't think of it as a chance now because it worked. Looking back on it now, but in fact, if you go back and listen to the episode that we did on this show, talking about, Robert speaks about just remembering what it was like in the theater, that opening sequence where the large, where the rebel ship is being chased by the Star Destroyer, and that was for 1977. That was something in terms of the special effects and the feel of it and all that. So this is a big budget film, but casting a black actor in that prominent of a role still went against, I think, a lot of what was considered to be safe bets by studio executives. And to your point, Eric, would there have been the romance triangle that we know of later, which gets really weird when we discover more in later films about what that's about?
Call forward to the episode we just got done recording, and we'll
Yes,
be released next time.
Yes, there you go. If you like the idea of, stay tuned for Wed Like an Egyptian, which is going to be the next released episode, and that has nothing. It has nothing to do with Egypt, believe it or not, in any great degree. But
it's about the only place we didn't touch in that episode. We might need to go back and do an extended cut, kind of a Blade Runner thing going on.
You're right.
Oh no.
I think do we keep or lose the voiceover depending on which cut you're talking about for Blade Runner 2? Eric, to your point, I think it's unlikely that would have been part of the story.
Yeah, and to me that was always like a pretty central part of Star Wars, because at heart I'm a romantic. But it was just, there was always this back and forth thing of like, are we going to have Luke and Leia get together? Because that was a late term decision for them to be siblings. And there was even like, I think it's called The Mind's Eye, which was a novelization, which was supposed to be the next movie. And it was proposed and it had gone back and forth, which gets rid of Han as a supporting character because of Harrison Ford having doubts of, did he want to continue with a sequel and see where that went. But even up to like 2004 with Hitch, starring Will Smith, originally he was supposed to act alongside Cameron Diaz, and the studio said, no, I don't think we can have a movie with Will Smith, one of the most bankable African-American stars, romance a white woman if the plot is not specifically them addressing we're in an interracial couple. And even the latest Star Wars movies have had this issue of utilizing Finn and his own, are they going to get together? Are they not going to get together? Romance with Rey, which has been another huge subject of controversy. So I do agree with you, unfortunately, Don, that probably they would have left it out.
Yeah, and maybe, and then the question is, how is the movie? We've talked. In fact, what we're going to talk about here, what we have to talk about here, which is why I think this is interesting, but is what was the impact on careers or on the movie by the casting choices that go both ways? Mm-hmm. That would have been a casting choice that would have had an impact, I think, on the narrative of the movie. Or if it didn't have an impact on the narrative of the movie, it's sad to say, but in 1977 America, it would have an impact on the reception of the movie in the public. This was not something that anybody had to get over in terms of their head, the fact that it was an interracial potential romance or even if it wasn't played as a romance in that, because it's the banter back and forth of which one of them is going to get the girl, so to speak. That's why it's sort of at that point the ambiguous triangle. And of course, everybody's rooting for Luke until they find out what they find later, which is why it can't go down that path, which is why it changes in The Empire Strikes Back. But I think America wasn't ready, for better or for worse, in 1977 for that to be what played out on the screen. And so if you cast a talented actor, in the case of Billy, I think Billy Dee Williams could have played the role, because he showed that sort of in the Lando role, how he had the chops for that particular role. It wouldn't have been a case of whether he was capable of pulling off, but how well it would have been received by the public.
Well, and I think I would dare say Han would be even more kind of sexier than Harrison Ford is able to pull off. Because sometimes Harrison Ford comes off as a little creepy in Empire Strikes Back when he has to do the romance scenes. And Billy Dee Williams would have played it perfectly.
Yeah,
So the one thing I'm thinking about is the other side of Star Exploration 5 movies series at this point, which is explicitly Star Trek, which was built explicitly on addressing that issue. And I want to say might have been a full decade before what you're talking about showed an interracial kiss on network television.
Correct.
So, part of me says one of the reasons that this might have affected this is I'm going to reveal myself here, and I think it's fine to say this. Star Wars is a little more on the fantasy, on the strict entertainment, and Star Trek kind of always had more of a technology and a social commentary focus, if that makes sense.
I think that's a fair thing to say. Star Trek were really more 1 hour moral plays that were set in against a science fiction backdrop in ways that they could do that. You know, the purpose of the release of Star Wars was to make money for a studio. I mean, that's what its primary purpose was.
And George Lucas, he attempted to buy the rights to Flash Gordon. He couldn't get that. He did talk to Gene Roddenberry about adapting Star Trek as a film. That was one of his ideas before eventually writing the Star Wars screenplay, which has been adopted into a graphic novel, and it is wild. It is so poorly written. A character literally says, it's Padme. I think I love her. Love. What is that to a Jedi?
Yeah,
so they cast Shatner.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is one of those things where the audio medium cannot do it justice, because I want to do things with my arms while I'm talking about this. To me, part of the reason I started with the Han Solo character is I think it is the most pivotal, interesting set of alternate casting choices, and also because, again, of the three, as I've sort of referred to them, Harrison Ford definitely goes on to have the largest career post Star Wars. I think, not to say that Carrie Fisher and Mark Hamill didn't have careers, but nothing in the arc of what Harrison Ford enjoyed, both in terms of diversity and then also success. So I think that's why I started with that as a character, because you can put other people in the other roles, and I don't think it's as noticeable in terms of the impact of what it would have done to their careers or what it would have done to the film.
Well, the last thing I'm just going to say is, just philosophically, Luke is who we all are. Han Solo is who we want to be.
I think that's true. Or, it's the, I think in the case of in the case of the Solo character, it's that men want to be him, women want to be with him, kind of thing, in terms of that bad boy attraction thing. He's got that edge to him, which is what they play on in the subsequent films, is sort of the tension, between, well, she's a princess, and he's a smuggler. There's that interesting thing of, princess versus smuggler. And this is the only other thing I'll say, because, we get to fast forward to 2022. I was having this conversation a couple of weeks ago with somebody. It's very difficult to actually see an advertisement these days on TV that doesn't feature interracial couples, or something where, from an advertising standpoint, this is now something that is embraced in the ad world of, being a broader appeal by having, in some cases it's interracial couples, it may be same-sex couples. I mean, just the diversity of what you see in advertising now is very different. That's become more the norm here in 2022. That was not 1977. And
Wow.
so, there's been a change that's happened over that. Now I stop and think about it. Now approaching, what is that? That's approaching, is that right? 45, we're at 45 years now. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, even from an LGBT perspective, if we want to go with a queer history reading in Star Wars comes out 4 years after the Stonewall riot?
Yeah.
Against the police. And it's oh, wow. And now we are at this point to where there's a lot greater acceptance and visibility. And it's getting to that point to where a lot of studios are realizing, oh, I just finished Our Flag Means Death, which if you love pirates and you love history, check it out. It's pretty fun. But even with that, where they talk about queer representation, it's like, oh, as long as it's good, people will watch it. But I will get off my soapbox for right now. But so out of all of the Hans we have discussed, which Han do you think will be the primary one? If not Harrison Ford. I'm still going with Kurt Russell.
Kurt Russell. The other one that's intriguing to me, which is just sort of a whole different avenue, we don't even have the time to talk about to really unpack it. Christopher Walken apparently read for the role, and I'm trying to imagine. I'm just trying to imagine Christopher Walken in that role, and I'm really struggling with it. I do think Kurt Russell would have been the one if he were cast there, of the ones who apparently really had a legitimate shot at being in this role, where it would have had the least impact on Star Wars as we know it. We would have just had a different. When we said Han Solo, we would have recognized, Kurt Russell pops into our head instead of Harrison Ford, and we'd have been okay with that. I think it's the least impactful in terms of the actual movie, and probably in terms of the actor having a career path. Kurt Russell probably has a little bit better career path as a result of that. And I don't know if Harrison Ford lands on his feet and still does what he does, because we don't know without Star Wars, is he offered the role of Indiana Jones? Does he? Another movie just popped into my head. One of my favorite movies, actually, Witness. That's a very different role than what he plays as Han Solo, or he plays as even Indiana Jones, which is an action role, has an intellectual bend to it. The Jack Ryan roles, as you mentioned, Chris, are what they are. Even when Harrison Ford plays the president, he gets to throw a couple of punches and and throw some physicality around. In Air Force One, get off my plane. But
also, Kurt Russell might just have been easier to deal with, because Harrison Ford, it was always like a whole back and forth of like, is he going to sign on for the next movie? He wants his character to die in Return of the Jedi because he's getting bored. Kurt Russell might just be a better, more calming presence to work with for a franchise.
I agree with that, and may have made it. I wonder sometimes would they have liked to have gone beyond a third movie faster than what they did. If you had the cast that was much more amenable to it, for whatever structure that might look like, you might have seen the Phantom Menace or whatever would have been done as the fourth film, Episode 1.
No.
You might have seen that in the late 80s versus when it actually showed up.
No, in the late 80s, it's going to be a crossover film, Escape from Hoth.
Well,
where they drop Governor Tarkin into a penal colony and you go to town. Yeah,
there was a plan for 9 movies originally.
Or at least that's Lucas's story that he likes to tell.
And Lucas likes to change the story a lot, to be fair.
Even after he's released the movie.
Yeah.
One of my favorite suggestions for a different director for Return of the Jedi, which as a child was my favorite of the Star Wars movies, I'm not going to deny it, David Lynch, which would have just been a very strange choice.
It would have been a strange choice. And by the way, that's about the time of Lynch's Dune. Been a little bit before Lynch's Dune, which was 84, I think, and Return of the Jedi was in 83, if my memory is serving. Those are my formative high school years. I should be able to remember them pretty well. But wow, David, it would have been very different.
George Lucas would have said, bullet dodged.
I'm just now trying to imagine Ewoks under Lynch's direction. That's the whole thing I'm just trying to get my head around, and I can't even get there. So let's shift over to the other roles, so we're not just all Han Solo all the time. The second most interesting one to me is the role of Leia and the alternatives that could have been there. It's interesting that Carrie Fisher. I'll let Eric go here in a second about another Carrie, potential relations to Carrie in another actor. In this case, the movie Carrie. But Carrie Fisher is unique in the sense that she has Hollywood connections, who her parents are, Debbie Reynolds, but she was not a known star. She was not a known quantity by any stretch of the imagination here, but certainly fit the physical appearance, I think, of what Lucas wanted in that role. Someone who had the looks, but was sort of an action oriented type of thing. But Eric, you were sharing what you were talking about off podcast. Probably the closest thing that actually happened here was was actually was she actually cast and they sort of swapped positions, or who was the actress that could have ended up being a princess from Alderaan?
So our miscongeniality, if you will, for Princess Leia was none other than Sissy Spacek. Sissy Spacek, she's probably most well known for being the titular role in Carrie, though she was also in movies such as Badlands in 1973, among many others. And essentially, George Lucas and Brian De Palma, who were pals, they were in that same kind of clique with Francis Ford Coppola and Steven Spielberg. They were hosting auditions together for both of their movies, Carrie and Star Wars. And Carrie Fisher had read for Carrie and was one of the front runners for that role. And Sissy Spacek was the front runner for Princess Leia. And eventually they basically had them read at the same time and thought, I think she would be just a better fit for our movie here. And then we'll give you Sissy Spacek for Carrie.
And so Carrie is released a year ahead of, it's in 76, it's released a year ahead of Star Wars. But I think you mentioned she had been in other roles. I don't think there were very many people that necessarily would have seen Sissy Spacek go, I've seen her before. It wouldn't have been, that's Sissy Spacek before Carrie. I think she's well known because of Carrie, and she's known after that for, as we mentioned, other roles here. Probably most notably in the near term after that being Coal Miner's Daughter. So I'll come back and circle on that here in a minute. But if Sissy Spacek is your Princess Leia, how do you guys take that? Do you buy that based upon what you've seen of her work after it?
God, that would be such a weird take, because I've mostly seen her in just very kind of passive, detached kind of roles. Like Carrie, she's amazing in Carrie. Don't get me wrong. I really also like her in Badlands when she's playing off Martin Sheen. But again, I have that same kind of concern of can she sell a fantasy movie? And I don't quite know. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a lot of Sissy Spacek's other movies. But, Don, you're from Texas. Sissy Spacek is from Texas. There must be a film library dedicated to her.
If there is, I don't know where it's at, and I can only think of a few of her. I mean, I know she was in, she had a bit part in JFK. She plays Garrison's wife. In that I've seen her in a lot of supporting roles, I guess, is the point that I'm making. And to your point, sort of more passive roles. Even in the one film I probably am most familiar with her being in a starring role would be Coal Miner's Daughter. That's just so different, in terms of trying to connect that to Leia in Star Wars. That's I can't even get my head around, connecting those two things together because the roles are just so different. One's a biopic, one's science fantasy fiction. They're just, the genres are not even where you can even get yourself around that. So again, she's a talented actress. We know she's a talented actress. She's been nominated for did she win an Academy Award? Am I thinking correct here?
She did win an Academy Award. She was also in The Help most recently.
Yeah. So part of what I think it's easy to get a dangerous path to go down is you can't imagine them in the roles, but then wait a second, they're professionals. they would have been able to manage the role, in some way, shape, form, or fashion. But it just seems so different. I mean, the other one that I remember seeing most frequently as an alternative casting here was Jodie Foster, who to me Jodie Foster is almost like the female Kurt Russell in this scenario at this point in her career path. She's done Disney films, I guess what Freaky Friday has come before this, and some of the other things that are there. I can easily see Jodie Foster stepping into that role, just like I could easily see Kurt Russell stepping into the Han Solo role. To me, that's not as much of a departure.
And I find it interesting that you mentioned Jodie Foster, because something that I was kind of mulling over in my head was Leia in the movie is an action star in her own right. Yes, there's the romance component, but she is an active participant in this plot and in what is going on. And that also was pretty unusual for a fantasy action movie in the 1970s. So I'm thinking about people, actresses of that period. I can't think of, and this may be why we're having difficulty coming up with people who we could see being that, because there weren't roles where we got to see them doing that.
Yeah, she was a damsel, but she wasn't a damsel in distress.
Right.
She very much is. Think about the iconic scenes where do you guys have a plan? You have to take charge of my own rescue here, kind of thing. A very different role, and I'm also thinking about just what baggage would have been brought to the role in the case of Foster. I mean, Foster had been in Taxi Driver,
Yeah,
and
she was 15 when Star Wars came out, so she would be a significantly younger Princess Leia.
yeah, and again, back to your point, Eric, about asking what impact might that have had on the actual script of the movie. Would it be would it be something that we actually ran into a couple of years later? Would it have been that little creepy thing of, yeah, she looks older, but Brooke Shields is kind of young, kind of, whereas that the audience is aware of the fact that, okay, yeah, this is all a movie and this is all, but, is she, is it okay for her to have, well, let's just put it this way, if it's still Harrison Ford, who's engaged in a love triangle there, that has a little bit more of a creepy feel to it, right?
Let's not get into the pretty baby of Brooke Shields. Let's not cross into that zone. Let's leave it be for now. But I do have, she's not discussed as having been cast, but who I think would have made a really, I have two actresses in mind of who would have been a really good Leias.
Okay.
The first is Olivia Hussey, best known for movies like Black Christmas and Zaffarelli's
Romeo and Juliet. Yeah.
I think she would do a great job. She can maintain a British or American accent, which Carrie Fisher unfortunately sometimes could not do. I love it. R.I.P. And then the other choice would have been Jessica Harper, kind of a B movie actress. She was in Suspiria. She was in Shock Treatment, which is the spiritual sequel to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. She was also in Phantom of the Paradise, another Brian De Palma. If you look up photos of her, you've probably have seen her around.
Yeah, in fact, I just had to do that. I Google searched while we were talking. It's like, oh, I recognize her, but I couldn't have connected the name with the face just right off the bat.
Yeah. If you need a crazy watch, Phantom of the Paradise, it's marvelous.
And so she would have been the right age and the right look for what I think we're going for there. I mean, it's interesting that one of the other casting calls that I saw was Cindy Williams of Laverne and Shirley fame, who, when you see Cindy Williams, yeah, I could have seen her physically as Leia. I don't know what the acting chops would have been around that, but I could see her physically in that role pretty quickly. I guess the last place, just sort of closing out the three here, Mark Hamill. Of course, right after Star Wars and in the period of time between Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, he was in an accident, had injury to his face, cosmetic surgery. His look changes, is restored, but he looks different. But man, in the original Star Wars, he is that, he looks like the young hero, doesn't he? I mean, it's like he's out of central casting to me. Am I the only one that sort of sees that, or is that just me putting on, looking at it through, the rearview mirror, knowing what he was going to be? Just to me, I can't imagine anybody else in that role because he fits the look of that role as much as anything else.
Yeah, he has that innocence kind of down. And one thing I've always really liked about his portrayal is that, oh my God, Luke is awful to be around, but he's able to bring that growth, and he has that like charisma that he's able to build. And one thing we will probably have to consider when we're doing these alternate castings is just the fact like this was not a they did not have too much of a budget to where they could have gotten the highest earning stars ever, which probably influenced things. But Mark Hamill is an excellent choice. But someone who, in a different world, if they had been just a bit more selfish, could have betrayed him. His roommate, Robert Englund, aka Freddy Krueger.
When I saw that note online, I just, again, because again, you know the roles that he eventually did play, so you immediately go there and can't put it back. But yeah, it's I have no words to say for that. I don't even know where to take that, but it's hard for me to even imagine that. And of course, the other thing that jumps out is that we talked about Kurt Russell earlier. Apparently, he was also up for consideration of the Luke Skywalker role. He was versatile, and he could have been either one. He could have been the roguish anti-hero. He could have been, because of his sort of Disney heritage, he could have been the good guy, young, innocent, regular hero type.
Yeah, I think he would just look too old for the role in a strange way. William Katt, best known as the greatest American hero, he was also Pippin in the Broadway show. Like, he definitely brings that kind of innocence, but I don't know if it would translate as like, oh yeah, this is a person who's past the point of being a teenager and is just entering the cusp of adulthood.
Right. And the interesting thing that I think to play there is, when you think about, we mentioned the love triangle sort of thing here, the way it was played out in the first film before it was altered in the storytelling to go what it was. But there's a certain fit that makes it look appropriate for Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher to be potentially what's going to come as a couple out of this thing. The age, the appearance, all of that stuff looks compatible and looks appropriate. And when you start deviating to some of the others that have been mentioned here, like you mentioned, Kurt Russell would have been older, so that would have been more awkward. Or some of the other things that are there, I think it's tougher to imagine how that would have worked the same way that it did. And of course, we are all guilty of the fact that it's tough to go back and unknow what you already know about who the cast is. It's hard to imagine somebody else in that role. The actor we mentioned earlier, I can't imagine anybody else playing Michael Corleone besides Al Pacino. That's because Al Pacino played the role, and that's who I saw play the role. So it's hard for me to imagine somebody else in the role.
Yeah, that's why I didn't invite you to my stage adaptation of The Godfather, where I play Michael Corleone.
Okay, Eric, I can believe you in that role now to a degree, but you probably found yourself struggling. I know what little bit of acting I did, not channeling the things that you had seen Pacino do in the role, right? I mean, it's
that is true. I would be the Fredo role. I'm very much aware of my gifts of like, oh yeah, I'd nail the hell out of Fredo. But yeah, it's hard to imagine. I think it would have to be some other like up and coming star, if anybody, who was like fresh faced and able to do it. I just don't think of the people who we have on the record could do the job.
Yeah.
I did find a fun side note for Lando though.
Hey, what's that?
Yaphet Kotto, aka Agent Bill Moseley, FBI, from Midnight Run.
And again, I have the problem there getting anybody but Billy Dee in the role. So it's
like Yaphet Kotto, he's great. Funny fact, Yaphet Kotto was considered for the role of Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Really, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that just popped into my head, it's interesting how this, how we often mentally ping pong as we're going through recording an episode here and what goes on with that. But one of the things I was struck by is that when you come around to the casting of the next trilogy, and so they're looking at the casting of Anakin, the role of Anakin, which they know is going to be This is the Anakin that will become not the child Anakin in Phantom Menace, but will be the older Anakin in the next two films. They end up with Hayden Christensen, and I'm not a Hayden Christensen fan. I will go on record as having said that. He what they were shooting to do there was the realization of they wanted to find an actor that didn't have a history where, again, they were looking to cast that new fresh face into the role because they wanted to cast what they had managed to pull off with Mark Hamill. They were looking to replicate with Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker. They rolled the dice and won, I think, with Mark Hamill in the original trilogy. A lot of people critically, I think, would say they rolled the dice and lost with Hayden Christensen, with that same methodology being what was driving the casting decision. Is we want to find a face that's not already established that will be the face of this role. No baggage, it's fresh, it's new, and worked out really well in 1977, worked out less well several decades later.
Well, I think another main problem that we have to get at is George Lucas is not like the world's best director when it comes to working with actors, and even with his writing of scripts. So, which is as much defense as I will give Hayden Christensen. Maybe he'll do a good job in Obi-Wan, and I'm down to see it. But I have seen him in Shattered Glass, which is really excellent. And I think it has Peter Sarsgaard as a supporting role, and it's about New Republic, whole scandal happening there, worth checking out. But Marcia Lucas, George Lucas's first wife, had been an integral part behind the scenes to helping George flush out the script. It was her idea of like, well, what if we gave Han and Leia like, a romantic interest going back and forth tete-a-tete within the script to maybe humanize them? What if we give Luke kind of an arc of where he's maturing into this role, rather than George Lucas's initial idea of kind of like, oh, I'm going to have this very stoic samurai character and then give them this very emotional dialogue and tell them act against the emotion.
Yeah. And to your point, I've heard that often by critics. So in some ways, Lucas succeeded despite himself, if that makes any sense, in terms of the things that weren't his strengths, but there was enough of the core story here and the timing of when it hit and, the phenomena that it came, that there are things that we look at now that are, the films I think stand up pretty well historically over time, all things considered. But when you go back and look at them now, you realize they were creatures of the 70s and the 80s in big ways. And they would not be made the same way today as they were then. You made another mention here to another film, actually a science fiction novel that's one of my favorites, which is Frank Herbert's Dune. And you look at David Lynch's directorial take on that versus the Denis Villeneuve take, which unfortunately came out during the time of COVID and didn't quite get the box office presentation that it would have otherwise. But I think arguably anybody who knows that story and knows the essence of it would look at Villeneuve's and go, wow, that's well done. That's a good adaptation of Herbert's universe. And Lynch's is just different in the 80s. But it's also the difference of the 80s versus where we are now in terms of how stories are told and just what works in film as well.
Brief thing. I did see the latest Dune with my good friend Robert Beale. Shout out to Robert. Love you, buddy. I had not read the book. I was familiar with the story, and I was whispering to Robert as we were in this movie theater pretty much by ourselves, and it's like, okay, has the movie started yet? We're like 25 minutes in, and it's like everything I'm watching is very interesting and I'm keyed into the story, but it's like, is the action about the film about to start? Also, why do we keep looking at this bull's head? Is it about to speak? Is this a murder by death thing? So yeah. It was a great time, but I see your point. David Cronenberg was also originally approached to direct Return of the Jedi, which also would have been a very strange choice.
Yeah, and essentially, I referenced there obviously something that's an adaptation. So if you're familiar with the novel and then you go to watch the movie, there's a lot of, especially in that particular in the case of Dune, I mean, the novel is one of the classics all time of science fiction because it just is. But there's a lot of background and things that are there that are able to be fleshed out in the novel that don't work well in a 2.5 or 3 hour movie, which is why Villeneuve has broken up into 2 films because he realized I needed more of a, and we have the rationale to do that. You think about Star Wars. Star Wars sprung onto the screen. Yes, there was a novelization, but the novelization came after the movie. The novelization was of the movie, and that was subsequently what happened. Then, of course, novels came out after that, but it's a very different way of telling a science fiction story. And a lot of science fiction, even to this day, comes from the written source and is adapted to film or television. Whereas Star Wars was that in that unique position of being, it was a movie. It was written as a script. It was intended to be a movie all along. Other things flow from that, but that's why the actors that are cast in the characters become so iconic because they are defining who the character is by their portrayal, and there's no other source material to attach it to that's not them. There's not, how did you imagine that character to be from the novel? Well, there is no novel. The novel was written as a novelization of the book. I remember reading, I still have, I think over here I'm looking to my left, I still have on my shelf the adapted Star Wars novelization of all of the first of the original movie, The Empire Strikes Back. Those were novels that were written off of the scripts of the movies, not the other way around. And so as a result, when you're reading the Star Wars novel as a kid, like I was, and you see Han Solo, you see Harrison Ford, you see Mark Hamill, you see that is the character. What the actors brought to it is part of what was there in the novelization versus the other way around. And that's taking us way off track, but I think it's relevant to why alternative casting can matter and stuff like this, because in this case, the actors define the roles, and the roles to a great degree define the careers of the actors. Anything else that you guys want to say just really quick before we bring it around to a close?
Well, I was going to suggest, do we all want to give our top 3 for the main trio of who we discussed here? Just kind of what we think would be best.
I think that's a good way. List a 1, 2, 3 who you would have liked to have seen. This is personal opinion. And Eric, I'll let you go first since you suggested. Pick a role and pick your 3.
Okay, for Han Solo, I'm going to go with Billy Dee Williams. I'm going to go with the controversial choice. I think he would have been far more of an elegant scoundrel that would have been excellent for that part. For Leia, I think I'm going to go with Olivia Hussey. I love her style of acting, and I think she would just make some really great choices. And because Mark Hamill is perfect as Luke, I am going to give you my choice for Yoda. Bob Hope.
Yoda, okay.
Bob Hope.
Bob Hope for Yoda.
Bob Hope.
I'm just going to let that stand there.
I love Bob Hope. I love the Road 2 movies. Don, you can't change my mind on this.
I now have Hope speaking in reverse syntax. I can't get my head fully around that. Mine for the thing, I think I'm going to go the line of, I think I'm going to go Russell for Han Solo. I think it would have been an interesting choice for the reasons that we've talked about to have a Jodie Foster in the role of Leia. I think she would have brought a slightly different edge to that role that would be an interesting thing to play out. And I'm going to stick with, because I just don't know who else would have been that fresh-faced kid to play the role of Luke, and I think it needed the fresh-faced kid. I'm going to stick with Mark Hamill there because I just don't know who else would have been in that time frame that I don't know about today. Who else would have fit that's there? I do think it would be interesting. I mentioned this in passing. I don't mention on the podcast or off, but apparently it's at one point when they realized they were going to need to voice over the Vader character because the dialogue had not been projected well captured in the regular filming. And I think James Earl Jones is the iconic Vader voice, but apparently Orson Welles was considered at some point. And I think Orson Welles would have been an interesting callback to, everything Orson Welles at that point. It would have Star Wars in some ways reinvigorated James Earl Jones's career. Not that he didn't have one before and wouldn't have one after, I think it would have been interesting to see what Orson Welles might have. Could we have had the second coming? Could Orson Welles have been Cher-like in the sense of every time you think he's gone away, here he comes again, reinventing himself? And I like the idea of a 1980 Orson Welles that has somehow come back into the consciousness as a result of re-emerging through the Star Wars trilogy and what that might have been.
So many more films that way. Who knows?
Who knows? Chris, you have any thoughts on that?
I like Russell. We didn't talk about it, but just in terms of somewhat time frame and a similar role, Sigourney Weaver is about to do Alien, which is probably, you know, I said there aren't many Leia-ish roles out there. I'm gonna go ahead and say that's one of them.
Yeah, Ripley qualifies.
Yes.
I am gonna softball the ending though to Don and give my interpretation of who should be Yoda, and that's Yogi Berra. Just both visually and yes.
I said this was a whimsical episode, so we've definitely qualified. And this episode's not over until it's over, by the way, for those of you playing at home. I'll pull my, and we conclude most episodes with our version of a yogiism anyway, with if you encounter a fork, you take it. So I can live with that. Playing Yoda is Yogi, so wouldn't have required much makeup either, now that I think about it.
Right, like when you close your eyes and picture it, no, you can see this, yeah.
And based on his spirituality, Yoda is kind of a yogi.
Yeah.
He is. It's sort of that's a strange. Wow. It's not even gonna. And then of course ultimately we would get the Mandalorian and we would get Baby Yogi, but that's neither here nor there down the road.
No, that's Boo Boo.
The horror.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on the one of the reasons for using this is sort of the touch point we talked about being around May the 4th, so we thought it'd be a fun thing to do. And this was a key tenet of the episode that we did early on in the podcast where we focused on this. This has altered culture. This is part of culture now for ever since 1977. You can't, you can say to an 8 or 9 year old now, Vader-esque, or you reference Vader, and they know who that is. They may not fully grasp what that is. In fact, I'll sort of close on this. I think it's an interesting thing. I was talking to somebody here in the last couple of days. I'm trying to remember what the context was, but they were talking about the fact that they had never lived in a time. They watched the Star Wars movie. They came to the Star Wars coworker. I know who it was. No, it was a coworker of mine. Shout out to Patrick, who's a coworker of mine. Talking about the fact that he got to see his now wife, his girlfriend at the time, watch The Empire Strikes Back here a couple of years ago, and she had never seen or wasn't familiar with the twist of I'm Your Father. And the point being is that he had never known a time in his life, even before he had seen the film, he knew what the course. So this was not a revelation to him in the same way that it was a revelation to those of us that were of that era and saw it in real time. He said to watch it unfold was sort of was an interesting thing to watch, to see someone's reaction to that. We were talking about other similar things in the fantasy realm of those that were familiar with George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones. Those of us that had read the books and knew that, spoiler alert here, Ned's gonna die in season 1. Okay, those of us that knew that was coming, but those of our coworkers or friends who were watching, who were just watching and didn't know, or there was, in fact, we referenced several other things in the Game of Thrones, the Red Wedding and other things that were of that ilk. You knew they were coming. It's like, just hold on, something's coming. And the reason I bring that up is even that twist, that idea that you twist something in a major way in film or in a serious thing here now, that was unique in 1980, Empire Strikes Back, because then it also did suddenly set up the change for, well, this is why Luke and Leia aren't going to get together. It's now, you learn something else that happens here and what goes on from that. Just the way that it twisted everything.
Listen to our next episode. It doesn't necessarily preclude it.
Yeah, you'll learn about the House of Fitzroy as we move forward here. All right, guys, I really appreciate you. Anything you want to say before we close it out? All right.
Not from my end.
We had a good long recording here. You're hearing that this episode will release before the next one. That's why you hear these references to the. You'll hear it in the next
Mhm.
episode, referencing back to the other because we knew we were going to record this. So we're releasing them out of the sequence of recording them back to back. Eric wants to say something.
May the fork be with you.
May the fork be with you. Ooh, we now have an episode title. I wasn't sure where the episode title was going to go, but now I know. May the fork be with you.
I am gonna say I am probably going to be that one person who insists that this was the first episode, even though the next episode was designed to come out late. Yeah.
Or what you're doing the take on there is how the following sequence of numbering 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9
Yes.
is a variant of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, I have to say Eric made reference to it earlier. I remember as a kid, we had book clubs that we would order through at school. I'm dating myself for those of you that know that the Scholastic book order process, if you're familiar with that. And one of the things that was like this little, golly, it was probably 16 pages, like almost like a little magazine kind of thing. That was one of the things you could order or you got free. And this was about the time of Star Wars as a phenomenon. This is post Star Wars, before Empire Strikes Back. And so it's like an interview with Lucas. And this is where he was talking about the fact that the plan all along was for 9, the whole, and I think the truth of the matter is they just randomly chose episode 4 just because it sounded good and it was taking off of the serial thing. And it's like you were jumping into the middle of it. I don't think there ever was a real 9 movie plan here, but he, that sounded great. And he wanted to make, 8 more movies if he could. So, because I remember in that interview, it's like, well, one of them could actually explore like the origin of the, it's like, if you had the story, why are you talking about what these could have been? Because they ended up not being what they were, but I remember what he discussed about there. But I can remember when this is referenced again. It's like the 4th reference to the previous episode that we did, because the other person on that episode was Ryan Cole. For those of you that have heard Ryan on a couple of episodes as well. And I remember going to see The Phantom Menace with like a midnight showing where they had an extra ticket. So I got invited along with Ryan, who was a tweenish age at the time. And so he got into Star Wars in The Phantom Menace period, then went back to pick up the other part. And then I know there's a whole other group that came to the last set of, not as many, but came to the last set. And so this thing has spanned 3 to 4 generations legitimately because of the timing of the trilogies and moving multiple generations along. And as hard as it is to believe, but a movie that featured, yes, I just said it, Jar Jar Binks actually, got some traction. Who'd have thunk that?
At least he wasn't played by Michael Jackson.
That's a good way to close this one out, Eric, is that's one of the alternate. Apparently Jackson wanted to play the role, which is even, you can't make this stuff up. You literally can't make this stuff up. Truth is always stranger than fiction. All right, Eric, Chris, appreciate you guys. We're going to close out the episode here. I'm just going to mention to our listeners, want to learn more about the podcast and delve back into all of our back catalog. You can find that at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Plenty of places there to give feedback. Even get you some logo stuff. I was drinking coffee this morning out of my Fork in Time mug. So if you want to support the show and represent the show, there's a couple places to do that. Even some Room Where It Happened merchandise is also there. Links for how you can get that. So for Chris and for Eric, I'm going to sign off by reminding our listeners our suggestion is if you encounter a fork in time, we suggest that you take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.